All right, guys. Hi, hello, welcome back. What we got going on today is a little bit more notes than normal, and it's just sort of the way that things are shaking out schedule-wise. So we're going to kind of dive right in. The focus here is on this 1980s, the Reagan era, which includes both terms of Reagan as well as George H.W. Bush. And during this 1980s, there are a handful of different they're just, again, concerns or issues that are impacting society. So we're going to talk about each of them, the different pieces. There still is struggle over civil rights. I mean, to this day, there's still struggle over civil rights in our country. Equality hasn't been met. So we'll talk a little bit about how that fight continues. And then I've got work to be completed and going from there. All right. So diving right in, notebooks out. So social concerns of the 80s. So the first of these concerns has to do with health. During the 1980s, a disease makes it to our country that has a detrimental effect on, again, hundreds of thousands of individuals, which is so very sad. And that is the introduction of the AIDS virus. The AIDS virus is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It is a virus that weakens a body so that it's prone to infections and rare cancers. It basically can't fight off of certain things. When the AIDS epidemic hit our country, at first, it was rather overlooked. We didn't understand it. There was a lot of just mystery about where it comes from and how does it spread, all that kind of stuff. Again, it is fatal, and it did kill lots of people. It's transmitted through bodily fluids. Fluids, again, blood, of course, saliva, again, thinking of semen. These are all the things that would allow for this disease to spread. It's not just a sexually transmitted disease. Quite famously, it is not. It can be any kind of transmission that happens. Yes, it can be sexual relations, or it could be just getting blood, or sharing, again, thinking about a later concern here, sharing a needle. These are all things that can transmit this disease, which is fatal. The epidemic got to some pretty scary heights in the 1980s, but once the government kind of recognized it for what it was and started to put a lot more time and energy, they managed to be able to contain it and then to stop the spread of it. It's, again, something that's still not fully understood to this day. Again, it's more common in less developed countries like in Africa. But it is still out there, and it was something that first came to the United States in the 1980s. Another social concern that, again, drew attention during this time period is the issue of abortion. Again, in 1973, the Roe versus Wade decision came down, which allowed abortion in the first trimester. That's a federal law that basically stated that. Pretty much the second that that decision came down the line, people kind of decamped into two sides, which is very typical of the United States. There's the pro-life side, who believe that life begins at conception, doesn't matter, again, first, second, third trimester, and it's murder to abort a child at any point. And then there's the pro-choice side, who believe that when it comes to medical concerns and to a female, again, a woman's body, that it's not the government's business to make that decision, whether they can do things or not. They should have the choice to make whatever decision they want to. This becomes such a, again, prevalent concern amongst the people in the 1980s that it does make its way back in front of the Supreme Court, where they changed the ruling. Again, that states, or that it says, that every state gets to decide what kind of abortion laws they have. So they are going to take that from a federal responsibility and give it to the states, which fits into Reagan and his time in office, kind of redistributing where things are at, deregulating various things, stuff overall, right? Another concern, and this connects back up to the AIDS epidemic, is the rise of drug abuse in our country. During the 1980s, there is going to be a scary spike of the amount of recreational drug users and the drugs that are kind of, I guess, in vogue, which is terrible, but correct, at that moment in time are highly addictive. So this is having, again, a detrimental impact on our population because more and more people are falling victim to addiction. Again, cocaine, crack, heroin, these are, again, drugs that have a very large impact on one's daily life. And that, of course, impacts the rest of the country because we're kind of, again, working all together to try and make this happen. The Reagans, especially Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, the first lady, is going to be particularly dedicated to trying to stop again, the spread of recreational drug usage. Reagan's war on drugs, if you've ever heard that phrase, just say no, that was coined for the, again, campaign against drug usage in our country. The Reagans are also going to try and again, put funding, federal funding into treatment facilities, things that we didn't need before or we thought we didn't need before, all of a sudden are becoming more and more necessary throughout this decade. So you can see there's all kinds of things that are contributing to this. The next issue that becomes kind of a hot button topic of discussion has to do with the education in our country. Apologize, my windows are open if you could hear that in the background. In the 1980s, the late 1980s, a study is published called A Nation at Risk. And this study basically stated that American students are falling behind the rest of the world that count. That we, as, again, Americans are not as smart or as skilled or as educated as countries who are considered to be our peers or our equals. Because of this study, it's actually H.W. Bush who is going to put together a commission to try and figure out how do we fix this. The suggestions from their panel of experts was to give more homework, to have longer school days, extend the school year, to increase pay and to increase pay for teachers, to change the way that raises are earned by merit versus by basically, again, how long you've been working. Again, Bush is also going to promote the choice of schools, so allowing people to kind of decide a little bit easier if they're going to send their kids to public, private, or religious education situations. Again, this is still something that's under discussion to this day. Again, how can we fix our educational system and what sorts of things can happen? The federal government does lay down a lot of laws with that. The final item that we're going to talk about feeds into our civil rights discussions, and it has to do with urban crisis. One of the reasons that education was struggling in the 80s is because a lot of the public schools were struggling to get funding. Again, you have to consider this. These are all systems connected to each other. Our economy is failing. Again, taxes are being cut. There are certain things that are going to also decline because of that, and education happens to be one of them. When you see this process. So when there's high unemployment, when taxes aren't being put together for infrastructure, there's not enough funds for sanitation and health services, there's not enough funds for schooling. Because of this, people become really frustrated. And as we've seen in the past, when people are living on top of each other in a situation that feels impossible, violence can break out. A good example of this is, again, the reaction to the Rodney King beating. Rodney King was, again, an African-American man who got pulled over by a bunch of white cops, and it's all caught on video. The cops pull him out of his car, and they beat him to nearly to death for no real good justifiable reason. And because his association, of course, with the civil rights issues, but also the fact that in cities, you see this sort of blowing up. The LA riots are really intense in the 1980s, and it has to do with a lot of these things. They all connect to each other. Things are falling apart, people feel frustrated, and they're going to react in a certain way, right? So the next thing we're going to talk about specifically has to do with women's rights during the 1980s. We know that the Equal Rights Amendment that was created in the 1970s was up for ratification. The timeline expired, though, before it was ratified by all of the states it needed to be. So what ends up happening is that women's rights start to change where their focus is. They start focusing on electing women to public office. Again, there is a spike, but it does stall out. The other focus that becomes a really big, again, topic amongst women's rights movement and organizations has to do with this idea of the feminization of poverty. Ultimately, it's talking about the inequality in regards to pay. It's more likely for women to fall below the poverty line because they're making less money than men would in the same exact job. So in the 1980s, again, evidence and data came out that women in certain jobs were earning 75 cents for every $1 that a man would make. And this becomes a big focus of these organizations to try and fight for pay equity, which basically is an attempt to throw out the old pay scales and to create something new that's much more and fair and not biased. So the pay is just based off of requirements of the job and not any other traditional approaches. Because again, the reason that a lot of this inequality in pay was happening is because of this was the tradition. This is how it worked. This is how it always was. But now that we know there's no reason for that, then the change has to happen. So ultimately, what this new pay scale would be, and again, a lot of industries did this, they went in there and they figured it out, is that jobs should be rated on a basis of amount of education required, the amount of physical strength needed, and then the number of people that a person or an employee would be supervising. Again, these different data points would determine how much you got paid, not anything else. It's just trying to streamline it and make it a little bit, again, better as far as that goes. The other fights for civil rights are continuing from the 1970s. They don't go away. They're still attempting to get equality. Again, it's just fallen a little bit into the wayside, I would say. You've got African Americans. They've made some nice political gains throughout the 1980s, but economically, they're still being looked down upon, still not being given the same economic opportunities as white Americans throughout this time period. There obviously were policies designed to correct the effects of reverse discrimination from affirmative action, but it has a negative impact on those who were benefiting from it, aka there's no perfect solution to this. And again, the fight continues. They're just going to keep asking for new solutions and new options and new abilities to try and, again, basically increase or improve their situation in life. During the 1980s, we're going to see that the fast and growing minority is going to be Latinos. Again, they're going to swell how many people are coming in. Politically, the movement has, again, served them well. Politically, you see multiple different governors of Latino descent. The Secretary of Education is, the Surgeon General. These are all massively important roles in American government. And again, that comes from fighting for their rights in the 1970s coming into the 80s. There also is still a fight for trying to be inclusive when it comes to bilingual education. That's something that they're still working really hard to try and fix or to get. We're going to see here that in Native Americans, unfortunately, Reagan is going to slash some of their funding for health and education and things like that. But he does work a new agreement with Native Americans that is going to open up the age of the casino, allowing them to become wealthy, and they have certain tax breaks and things like that. It really fits with the tax cuts of the 1980s and Reaganomics. The last group who are going to start to stand up for themselves and demand to be treated the same, because all civil rights that's the whole thing. To be treated the same for something you cannot control is a huge, important part of being free and being part of this nation. So we're going to start to see gay rights. Again, the very early fight for this in the attempt to try and destigmatize, again, sexual orientation in our country. It really starts here, this fight to try and be treated the same, again, just like any of these other things, for something they cannot control. So just calling for an end to anti-gay discrimination. Still in the 1980s, it was, again, considered a crime in certain places. And of course, there were the unwritten rules when it came to this kind of stuff, which, again, kept people feeling less than in their country overall. Okay. Whew. It's a lot. There's a lot of stuff. Again, I just copied and pasted this. Your reading activity is done. That's already submitted. So all you should be focused on is your Read Like a Historian for Reaganomics, which is looking at, was it good or bad for our country, the different things that Reagan did. You're getting 8 total pieces of evidence. I misspoke yesterday as well. Man, I'm just killing it. And then you'll be writing a proper paragraph at the end, claim, evidence, analysis, just like always. Again, you've got an assessment on Friday, and there's a little review packet out there that you can fill out free, see if you'd like. It's a smaller unit, so there's not quite as many questions. It's a little bit more straightforward. Please plan in advance for this. And I had way more people miss out on this assessment last time. Again, the sooner you let me know that something funky is going to go on, or if there's some weird scheduling thing, the more likely I'm going to give you a break. I can tell you, though, that as this semester comes to a close, if I'm still running into the same kind of resistance to get your work done when it is scheduled, when you know about it in advance, be a little bit less likely to work with you and to get things scheduled out in a good way. All right. Please make sure you email me with questions. And if there's anything else, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good day.